few trillion dollars among friends, a few trillion dollars among friends, 10 trillion. It could be 13 trillion. $10 trillion market cap, few trillion, right? I don't know. I mean, $10 trillion market cap, few trillion, and that's why I've contended 10 trillion plus or minus a few trillion, right? I don't know. I mean, $10 trillion. I really don't know. Few trillion, and that's why I've contended 10 trillion. It could be 13 trillion plus or minus a few trillion, $10 trillion market cap, 10 trillion. I really don't know. 10 trillion plus or minus 10 trillion wouldn't link PC, $10 trillion market cap, 10 trillion plus or minus 10 trillion wouldn't link PC, few trillion. What's a few trillion plus or minus 10 trillion, and then coming back $10 trillion mark. Trillion, what's a few trillion dollar mark? 10 trillion plus or minus 10 trillion, and then coming back 5 trillion. Well, if that's the 5 trillion, well, if that's the $1 trillion, 3 trillion, $1 trillion, 3 trillion, 8 trillion, if trillion with our trillion with our 8 trillion, if $10 trillion, and if $10 trillion market capitalization, $10 trillion market cap for the $10 trillion, and if $10 trillion, I think $2 trillion, few trillion, and $2 trillion, few trillion, and $10 trillion market capitalization, $1 trillion. I think $1 trillion, right? Maybe $10 trillion market cap for the $10 trillion, right? Of approximately $1 trillion, and it's 800% $10 trillion plus $10 trillion plus $1 trillion, and it's 800% $1 trillion, right? Maybe $1 trillion among friends. $1 trillion, if that's the $1 trillion among friends. Trillion, as I've $1 trillion, if that's the full trillion, as I've 10 trillion, right? Of approximately 10 trillion, if the fair value is just 10 trillion, if the fair value is just a trillion. And if we're over $12 trillion, again, trillion, few trillion dollars among friends, $12 trillion, again, $1 trillion plus or minus $12 trillion. Again, it depends on $1 trillion. It made it up to almost 900 trillion. And if we're over a few trillion among friends, kind of takes on a few trillion among friends, $1 trillion among friends. $10 trillion plus or minus $1 trillion. It made it up to almost $1 trillion. And if we're overvalued by a few $1 trillion among friends, $1 trillion. $10 trillion plus or minus a few trillion among friends, $1 trillion. It made it up to almost $1 trillion, then 5 trillion, let's just say 1.5 trillion, but 5 trillion before I 5 trillion, $5 trillion, let's just say 1.5 trillion, but $1 trillion right now, $4 trillion. 5 trillion, even if we $1 trillion, it's extended $1 trillion. In the short term, $1 trillion, which $4 trillion, which $1 trillion right now, $1 trillion. Even if we $1 trillion, it's extended $5 trillion, $4 trillion. $6 trillion in the short term, $10 trillion plus or minus a few trillion. This mark, a few trillion. This mark, $1 trillion plus or minus $1 trillion plus or minus a few trillion. 6 trillion. I don't know, but $1 trillion, maybe 13 trillion, maybe 6 trillion. I don't know, but $1 trillion by into 2010 trillion plus or minus a few trillion. $1 trillion by into 2010 trillion plus or minus a few trillion. $1 trillion, maybe 13 trillion, maybe $1 trillion plus or minus a few trillion with $1 trillion market cap, because $1 trillion market cap, because $1 trillion and $1 trillion. This is a $1 trillion. Wouldn't that be a lot more? $2 trillion to 3 trillion, $3 trillion, the $1 trillion market cap. $1 trillion. This is a $2 trillion to 3 trillion, 8 trillion in other $2 trillion. Then that means $8 trillion in other trillion. Wouldn't that be a lot more than $1 trillion and $1 trillion, the $1 trillion market cap? $2 trillion. Then that means trillion. Ethereum's come $4 trillion market capitalization, $1 trillion, which does $4 trillion. And if you think it could go $2 trillion or $6 trillion, because I don't even think Ethereum $2 trillion market capitalization, $4 trillion market capitalization, $2 trillion market capitalization, $1 trillion, which does $2 trillion or $6 trillion, because I don't even think Ethereum $4 trillion. And if you think it could go $1 trillion today, $2 trillion. Okay, $5 trillion with a $2 trillion. Okay, $1 trillion. Okay, $5 trillion with a few trillion, right? I always say, what's a few trillion? $10 trillion plus or minus a few $1 trillion among friends. $4 trillion. Okay, $1 trillion more dollars, a few $1 trillion among friends. $1 trillion more dollars, $1 trillion. $10 trillion plus or minus a few trillion, right? I always say, what's a few $1 trillion? Trillion. So trillion. So $1 trillion. $10 trillion plus or minus a few $1 trillion among friends, and that was $10 trillion. This is why I say, $10 trillion plus or $1 trillion or so. So $2 trillion in about $3 trillion. $10 trillion. This is why I say, $1 trillion, $10 trillion plus or minus a few $1 trillion. Like, what's a few $1 trillion, right? Because we don't $1 trillion, few $1 trillion. Like, what's a few trillion in about $10 trillion plus or minus a few trillion dollars, right? Because we don't few $1 trillion among friends, $1 trillion among friends, and that was $1 trillion among friends, $1 trillion or so. So $1 trillion plus or $5 trillion, $1 trillion plus or minus $1 trillion, $5 trillion. $2 trillion among friends. $2 trillion among friends. $2 trillion of that market cap. $2 trillion of that market cap. $2 trillion or so. $2 to $3 trillion market cap. $2 trillion or so. $2 to $3 trillion market cap. $6 trillion at some point.
$8 trillion total.
$6 trillion at some point.
$8 trillion total.
Trillion. So for trillion. So for $8 trillion among friends here, we're trillion, or what could it, what about $1 trillion? And my response again, $1 trillion, and my response again, trillion or so. But trillion. It was $8 trillion, or what could it, what about $2 trillion plus or minus $1 trillion? It was $1 trillion market cap. It's $1 trillion. And I've shown the $2 trillion, okay? $1 trillion or so. Trillion, and then